A Mercedes veers, mud erupts. Grace Mbatha, a cleaner soaked in filth, stands frozen on Elmwood Drive, humiliated by Victoria Langford, the neighborhood's queen of cruelty. But what Victoria didn't know, her father saw it all. From the rearview mirror of his vintage Jaguar, Arthur Langford watched his daughter's deliberate act, and it shattered him. What follows isn't just a reckoning between father and daughter. It's a reckoning for an entire community built on quiet cruelty and a maid who refused to stay invisible. The morning commute was a murky ballet of slick asphalt and hurried shadows. Grace Mbatha, her worn cleaning uniform clinging damply to her slender frame, navigated the glistening pavements of Elmwood Drive, each step a testament to the unyielding grind of survival. Rain, a relentless drizzle for hours, had thickened into a sudden downpour, transforming the grand manicured lawns of the wealthy Langford estate into a series of shimmering green slopes. Grace clutched her battered bag closer, her eyes fixed on the pavement ahead, a faint tremor of fatigue in her shoulders. She was late for her next shift, a small, independent cleaning job for Mrs. Henderson, a kind, elderly woman further down the prestigious street. For Grace, every minute counted, every cent earned was a brick laid in the precarious foundation of her family's meager existence. Her dark skin, a beacon against the gray morning, often drew an unwanted, almost imperceptible scrutiny in these affluent, predominantly white neighborhoods. But Grace had long since learned to fold herself into the periphery, a ghost of labor moving through lives of effortless luxury. As she rounded the bend near the imposing wrought iron gates of the Langford mansion, a sleek, obsidian black Mercedes-Benz S-Class, a fortress of polished chrome and tinted glass, roared past, its engine a guttural growl against the steady drumming of rain. The driver, Victoria Langford, a woman whose name was synonymous with privilege and a brittle, condescending charm, was notoriously reckless on these narrow, tree-lined streets. Grace braced herself instinctively, a familiar dread coiling in her stomach. Elmwood Drive was known for its deep, unforgiving puddles, particularly after a heavy rain, and the Mercedes was hurtling directly towards one, a dark, reflective expanse mirroring the bruised sky. Grace tried to step back, to press herself against the cold stone wall of the sprawling hedge, but it was too late. With a vicious, deliberate swerve, the Mercedes veered sharply into the colossal puddle. A tidal wave of muddy, frigid water erupted with explosive force, a brown, churning geyser that arced high into the air before crashing down upon Grace. It wasn't an accident. The angle, the timing, the slight, almost imperceptible pause before the car accelerated again. It was a calculated act of cruelty. Her uniform, once a crisp blue, was instantly transformed into a sodden, clinging canvas of grime and silt. Mud splattered across her face, stinging her eyes, caking her hair, and filling her mouth with the bitter taste of earth and humiliation. The cold shock stole her breath, leaving her gasping, a raw, ragged sound lost in the sudden, eerie silence that followed the car's departure. Through the stinging mud in her eyes, Grace saw the Mercedes momentarily slow, not to apologize, but for a split second. The tinted passenger window lowered just enough for her to glimpse Victoria Langford's face. A thin, almost imperceptible smile played on her lips, a flicker of cold amusement in her eyes, before the window silently ascended, sealing away the architect of Grace's degradation. The vehicle then peeled away, leaving behind only the acrid scent of exhaust fumes and the cold, dripping evidence of its passage. Grace stood rooted to the spot, a statue sculpted from mud and indignity. Her body trembled, not from cold, but from the raw, searing indignity that threatened to overwhelm her. The instinct to scream, to pound on the retreating car, to unleash the torrent of fury that raged within her, was immense, but it was quickly, brutally, suppressed. She squeezed her eyes shut, a silent battle raging within her as tears mingled with the mud on her cheeks. She was Grace Mbatha, a cleaner, a mother, a survivor. Screaming would change nothing. It would only draw attention, invite more scorn, and perhaps even cost her the few precarious jobs that kept her family from starvation. She couldn't afford a scene. She couldn't afford to be anything but invisible. This was the price of survival in a world that often saw her as little more than a disposable utility with immense effort. Grace forced herself to take a shaky breath. She opened her eyes, surveying the muddy ruin of her clothes, the gritty residue clinging to her skin. Her hands balled into fists, then slowly, painfully, relaxed. She began to walk, each step heavy, the squelch of her waterlogged shoes a pathetic accompaniment to her silent despair. Her destination, Mrs. Henderson's house, now felt like 1,000 miles away, a place she could not possibly arrive at in such a state. She would have to go home, clean herself, and then rush back, hoping Ms. Henderson would understand. It meant lost time, lost wages, and a deepening chasm of worry in her already burdened heart. The deliberate act of cruelty, the knowing smirk on Victoria Langford's face, etched itself into Grace's memory, a fresh wound bleeding into old, unhealed scars. She felt utterly exposed, not just to the elements, but to the callous indifference of a society that routinely trampled on the dignity of those at its margins. What Victoria Langford did not know, what she could not have known in her bubble of insulated privilege, was that her brazen act of disdain had not gone unobserved. Arthur Langford, Victoria's father, a man of quiet integrity and stern principles, had been watching. He had been in his vintage Jaguar, just turning into the drive from a secluded side road after an early morning meeting. When his daughter's Mercedes had passed him in a blur of speed, he had slowed, noticing the exceptionally large puddle near the bend, and then, with dawning horror, he witnessed the entirety of Victoria's calculated act. He saw the deliberate swerve, the colossal splash, and the pathetic, mud-drenched figure of Grace Mbatha standing frozen in the downpour. He saw the faint, cruel smile on his daughter's face before she sped away. Arthur Langford felt a cold knot of shame tighten in his stomach. He knew Grace Mbatha, not personally, but by sight. She was one of the many hard-working individuals who maintained the invisible machinery of his privileged world. He respected the quiet dignity of her labor. To see her subjected to such a humiliating and malicious act, by his own daughter no less, filled him with a profound sense of disgust. He watched Grace, a small, solitary figure of resilience, turn and slowly, painfully, trudge away. He saw her shoulders slump, then square, a silent testament to a spirit that refused to be completely broken. He didn't intervene immediately. His mind, usually a fortress of logical thought, reeled from the sudden, stark confrontation with Victoria's true character. This wasn't just recklessness. This was malice, born of an ingrained sense of superiority. He knew, with chilling certainty, that this act would not go unaddressed. A reckoning was coming, not just for Victoria, but for the entire carefully constructed facade of their family's moral standing. The mud on Grace Mbatha's uniform was not just dirt, it was a stain on the Langford name. A stain that Arthur Langford was determined to see cleansed, no matter the cost. His jaw tightened, a steely resolve settling deep within his usually calm demeanor. Grace Mbatha, a black cleaner, was humiliated on her commute when Victoria Langford, a wealthy white woman, deliberately drove her Mercedes through a large puddle, splashing Grace with mud. Grace suppressed her rage, choosing to endure the indignity due to her precarious financial situation. Unbeknownst to Victoria, her father, Arthur Langford, witnessed the entire malicious act and was disgusted by his daughter's cruelty. Resolving to address the issue, the cold, wet mud clinging to Grace's skin felt like a shroud, heavy and suffocating. It wasn't just the physical grime, it was the residue of Victoria Langford's calculated disdain, a palpable weight that pressed down on her spirit. As Grace trudged forward, every squelch of her sodden shoes on the pavement was a grim echo, pulling her back through time to another moment when humiliation had steeped her in a bitterness that tasted of earth and betrayal. Her current silence, her practiced endurance, was not born of weakness, but forged in the searing crucible of a past where protest had proven not just futile, but perilous. She was 17, a sapling reaching for the sun, when her world had abruptly tilted. Her family, newly arrived from the sun-baked plains of Kenya, had found a precarious foothold in a small American town. Her father, a man whose hands bore the rough marks of honest labor and whose eyes held the wisdom of generations, toiled in the fields, his back perpetually bowed. Grace, bright-eyed and eager, had secured a summer internship at the town's venerable public library. It was a sanctuary of hushed whispers and comforting paper, a place where she envisioned her future taking root, flourishing beyond the dusty fields in the weary grind of manual labor. Mrs. Davies, the head librarian, a woman whose prim exterior belied a sharp, almost predatory gaze, had initially seemed benevolent, praising Grace's quiet diligence, her meticulous organization, her respectful demeanor. Grace absorbed every task, every lesson, dreaming of college, of a life imbued with the dignity of knowledge. The air in the library that sweltering August afternoon had been thick with the scent of old paper and an unspoken tension. A priceless first edition, a signed, leather-bound volume of Frost's poetry, had vanished from the special collections room, a chamber only accessible to Mrs. Davies and her 3 interns. Panic had rippled through the usually serene halls. Grace, along with 2 other interns, Bethany and Chloe, both from old, prominent town families, were the only ones who had been in the room. The initial search was frantic, fruitless. Grace, though, noticed the subtle shift in Mrs. Davies's gaze, a chilling, assessing glint that settled on Grace's dark skin, lingering for a beat too long. The next morning, Miss Davies summoned Grace to her office. The room felt suddenly like a suffocating box, the polished mahogany desk a barrier, not a surface. "Oh, Grace, Miss," Davies began, her voice a low, mournful sigh. "I'm afraid we've located the book, and I am utterly heartbroken." Grace's heart pounded, a sudden surge of adrenaline and a flicker of hope. Oh, thank heavens. Where was it? Mrs. Davies. The librarian's expression was a masterpiece of contrived sorrow. "In your satchel, Grace, tucked beneath your lunch, precisely where you would conceal something you wished to spirit away." Grace stared, utterly aghast, the words slicing through her like shards of ice. "No, that's a lie. I didn't take it." Her voice rose, raw with a sudden, primal terror, echoing off the silent, accusing walls. She felt the blood drain from her face, leaving a cold hollowness. She had meticulously packed her worn canvas satchel that morning, every item accounted for. She knew with a certainty that chilled her to the bone that the book had not been there. She was being framed. She saw the orchestrated betrayal, the carefully placed evidence, the swift, undeniable judgment. It wasn't just an accusation. It was an execution of her character. She tried to explain, to plead, her voice hoarse with desperation. She spoke of her family's honor, their struggles, their unyielding belief in integrity. But Mrs. Davies remained a stone edifice of polite disbelief, her gaze unwavering, fixed on some internal, predetermined verdict. Later, Grace would learn that Bethany and Chloe, those seemingly innocuous, soft-spoken girls, had, in their individual interviews, subtly steered the suspicion toward Grace, their quiet inferences bolstering Mrs. Davies's existing biases. Grace was an outsider, a newcomer, her dark skin a silent testament to her otherness in their insular, white community. Her family's humble circumstances became another unspoken mark against her, proof of a perceived moral weakness. Her father arrived, his face a mask of bewildered pain, his customary stoicism shattered. He stood before Mrs. Davies, a man of quiet dignity reduced to pleading in his heavily accented English, trying to defend his daughter's honor against an invisible current of prejudice. But the weight of circumstantial evidence, meticulously constructed and amplified by the insidious undercurrents of racial bias, was an insurmountable wall. Grace was dismissed. Her internship terminated with chilling finality. No police, no formal charges. The library preferred to avoid a public scandal. But the invisible stain of thief clung to Grace, whispered through the town, through the small immigrant community that had once welcomed her family with open arms. The shame, a corrosive acid, ate away at her youthful spirit, leaving behind a hard, unyielding core. That day, watching her father's proud shoulders slump as they walked away from the library, seeing the raw, unaccustomed despair in his eyes, Grace made a silent, unshakable vow. She would never again allow herself to be so vulnerable, so easily broken, so readily dismissed. She learned that screaming defiance often only confirmed the prejudices of those in power, painting the victim as volatile, untrustworthy. Her family, struggling for every breath in a new land, couldn't afford that kind of scrutiny, that kind of risk. They needed stability, quiet perseverance. The intervening years had only deepened that resolve. When her younger brother fell prey to a debilitating respiratory illness, demanding an endless stream of expensive medication, Grace took on every cleaning job she could find, sacrificing her own academic aspirations for his fragile breath. When her mother's hands grew gnarled with arthritis, unable to weave the intricate baskets that had once supplemented their income, Grace worked extra shifts, her own fingers aching, her body protesting, but her will unbent. The world was a relentless, unfair place, but it offered fleeting, fragile opportunities. To lose those, to ignite a firestorm of public outrage for a moment of righteous indignation, seemed to Grace a luxury she could not afford, a foolish gamble with her family's very survival. So now, as the icy mud seeped deeper into her clothes, the memory of Victoria Langford's sneer was not just a fresh wound, but a familiar one, echoing a lifetime of similar experiences. The public humiliation, the deliberate malice, it certainly hurt, a sharp, searing pain, but it was a pain she had learned to endure, to compartmentalize, to bury beneath layers of ironclad resilience. She had to get to Madame Henderson's. She had to clean herself first, then clean the house. Her son, waiting at home, depended on her. The path of quiet endurance, the path of silent survival, was the only viable one. It was the path that kept them afloat, even if it meant her spirit sometimes felt as bruised and muddy as her uniform. The fight was internal, a fierce, silent battle against the encroaching despair, rather than an outward confrontation with the world's relentless, casual cruelty. Every dollar earned, every indignity swallowed, was a calculated sacrifice on the altar of her family's precarious, hard-won existence. The incident with Victoria Langford was a fresh bruise on Grace's spirit, but the demands of life afforded her no time for prolonged introspection. She went home, scrubbed the mud from her skin and hair, and meticulously cleaned her uniform. The faint scent of disinfectant, a stark contrast to the lingering stench of humiliation. Mrs. Henderson, bless her kind heart, understood Grace's tardiness. Her gentle wave of dismissal, a small balm on the raw edges of Grace's composure. But the encounter was a grim reminder of the insidious undercurrents that shaped her existence, a constant, low-level hum of discrimination that permeated her every interaction in this affluent world. Every day, Grace navigated a labyrinth of subtle slights and unspoken assumptions. In the pristine homes of Elmwood Drive, she was often treated as an extension of the furniture, an invisible presence designed to maintain order and cleanliness without disrupting the delicate sensibilities of her employers. Conversations would abruptly cease when she entered a room, hushed tones replacing vibrant chatter. Children, emboldened by their parents' veiled condescension, would sometimes point, their innocent fingers tracing the outline of her dark skin, their eyes wide with an uncritical curiosity that felt, to Grace, like an invasion. She learned to move silently, to blend into the background, a shadow among the gilded heirlooms and polished surfaces. The systemic abuse wasn't always overt like Victoria Langford's act. More often, it manifested in the quiet denial of opportunity, the subtle rejections that chipped away at her dignity. She recalled applying for a full-time position at a prestigious cleaning agency last year, a role that promised better pay, benefits, and a modicum of security. She was highly qualified, with years of experience and impeccable references. The interview had gone well. The manager, a brisk middle-aged woman named Ms. Albright, a name that sent an involuntary shiver down Grace's spine, had seemed impressed. Excellent qualifications. Grace, we'll be in touch. But the call never came. Weeks later, she saw a new, much younger white woman being introduced as the agency's latest hire. A woman whose resume Grace knew, through a mutual acquaintance, was far less extensive than her own. The subtle sting of that dismissal, the unspoken reason for the preference, was a familiar ache, a testament to the invisible barriers she constantly encountered. Her financial struggles were a relentless tide. Her son, Imani, a bright, sensitive boy who dreamed of becoming an engineer, needed new textbooks for his advanced math class, books that cost a small fortune. His chronic respiratory condition, a legacy of the polluted air in their cramped inner-city apartment building, required regular visits to the clinic and costly nebulizer treatments. The clinic, perpetually understaffed and overburdened, treated its lower-income patients with a weary indifference that bordered on neglect. Grace often waited hours for Imani to be seen, watching, helpless, as others who arrived later, with lighter skin and crisper clothes, were called in first. She dared not complain, fearing they would be dismissed, left without the vital care Imani needed. This was the quiet, grinding oppression of poverty interwoven with racial bias, a heavy blanket that smothered hope. One afternoon, while working at the sprawling mansion of the Dubois family, Grace overheard a conversation that twisted a knife in her gut. Mrs. Dubois, a benevolent-seeming woman who often left out bottles of expensive sparkling water for Grace, was on the phone with a friend. "Oh, she purred. "My cleaning lady is just fantastic, so efficient and reliable. These people are just so grateful for the work. They never complain. Really takes the hassle out of it." The words, though seemingly innocuous, were a fresh articulation of the casual dehumanization Grace faced. These people, her identity, her individual worth, flattened into a generalized, grateful stereotype. She was not Grace Mbatha, a hard-working woman with dreams and burdens. She was simply these people, a convenient, compliant labor force. Another instance, more overt, occurred at the local grocery store, a high-end establishment favored by Elmwood Drive residents. Grace was carefully comparing prices of fresh produce, trying to stretch her meager budget. A young white security guard, barely out of his teens, began to follow her, his eyes fixed on her basket. He shadowed her through the aisles, his presence a palpable accusation. Grace, acutely aware of his scrutiny, felt her cheeks flush with a familiar shame and undeserved guilt. She bought her items, paid, and left, the guard's watchful gaze following her until she was out the door. The encounter, a minor humiliation, was a stark reminder that even in public spaces, she was often viewed with suspicion, her race a silent warrant for surveillance. Grace found solace in the quiet moments of her life, her son's infectious laughter, the scent of fresh bread baking, the worn pages of an old book. But even these small joys were tinged with the constant anxiety of scarcity. She lived in a perpetual state of vigilance. Every decision weighed against its potential impact on her family's fragile stability. She couldn't afford to get sick, to lose a bureau, to attract negative attention. The memory of the library incident, the casual dismissal of her truth, was a powerful deterrent against any outward show of anger or frustration. It had taught her that the systems in place were designed to uphold the status quo, to protect those with power and privilege, and to silence those who dared to challenge it. Her quiet endurance was a form of self-preservation, a grim acceptance of the unspoken rules of her world. Yet, a subtle shift was occurring within her. The repeated indignities, the accumulation of microaggressions, the chilling memory of Victoria Langford's sneer were slowly eroding her carefully constructed stoicism. Each new slight, each fresh reminder of her diminished standing, was like a drop of water, slowly but inexorably, wearing away at the stone of her resolve. The world was demanding more from her than silent endurance. It was demanding a piece of her soul. She looked at Imani, his face alight with the innocent certainty of youth, and a fierce, unfamiliar protectiveness stirred within her. Was this the life she wanted for him? A life defined by quiet submission? The question, though unvoiced, began to echo in the chambers of her heart, a faint, growing tremor of something akin to rebellion. The silence that had once protected her was beginning to feel like a cage. The casual contempt of Mrs. Dubois, the phantom touch of the security guard's gaze, and the lingering taste of mud from Victoria Langford's deliberate cruelty coalesced into a simmering resentment within Grace. Her long-held philosophy of silent endurance, once a shield, now felt like a suffocating blanket. The turning point arrived subtly, unexpectedly, not with a roar, but with a quiet, persistent nudging from a most unexpected source. Leo, Mrs. Henderson's aged golden retriever. Grace continued her cleaning duties at Mrs. Henderson's house, a sanctuary of sorts amidst the gilded cages of Elmwood Drive. Mrs. Henderson, frail and gentle, was one of the few employers who saw Grace, truly saw her, beyond the uniform and the color of her skin. On this particular Tuesday, as Grace meticulously polished the antique mahogany table in the sun-drenched living room, Leo, usually content to doze by the fireplace, began to stir. He was a majestic old dog, his fur a rich, faded gold, his eyes clouded with the wisdom of years. He padded over to Grace, nudging her hand with his wet nose, a soft whine escaping his throat. Grace, accustomed to his quiet affection, patted his head, but Leo persisted, a low, insistent growl rumbling in his chest, not aggressive but urgent. He nudged her again, then turned, looking expectantly towards the grand bay window that overlooked the manicured front lawn. His tail, usually a lazy pendulum, now wagged with an insistent rhythm. He let out a sharp, decisive bark. Grace, puzzled, followed his gaze. Outside, a familiar glint of black chrome caught her eye. It was Victoria Langford's Mercedes, parked conspicuously across the street, directly in front of Ms. Henderson's driveway. Victoria herself was not visible, but the presence of her car, a silent, arrogant monument to her earlier act, sent a jolt of fresh anger through Grace. It was a brazen display, a silent taunt. Leo whined again, then turned and began to scratch impatiently at the front door. He looked back at Grace, his eyes holding an unusual intensity, as if urging her to action. It was an uncanny moment, almost as if the old dog sensed the deep-seated injustice that Grace carried. He was not just reacting to a car, he was reacting to the simmering anger, the unspoken wound. A flicker of something unfamiliar stirred in Grace's chest. For years, she had bent, she had endured, she had made herself invisible. But Leo's insistent nudges, his low, urging growls, felt like a silent command, a primal call to a forgotten part of herself. He wasn't asking her to fight, but to acknowledge them all, to not let it pass. She took a deep breath, the scent of lemon polish and old dog mingling in the air. "What is it?" "Boy," she murmured, more to herself than to the dog. She knew what it was. It was the audacity, the sheer, unadulterated arrogance of Victoria Langford, parking her instrument of humiliation right outside the one place Grace felt a shred of safety. Suddenly, a voice, sharp and imperious, pierced the morning quiet. "Grace, are you going to answer the door? Or are you just going to stand there gawking?" Grace flinched. It was Mrs. Albright's voice, the very same woman from the cleaning agency she had applied to, the one who had dismissed her with such polite finality. Mrs. Albright stood on Mrs. Henderson's porch, a clipboard clutched in her hand, her face a mask of pinched disapproval. Behind her, a younger, pale woman, clearly the new hire Grace had seen, stood stiffly, a nervous flutter in her eyes. It became clear then Mrs. Albright was conducting an inspection, perhaps even a performance review of Mrs. Henderson's existing cleaning arrangements, with a subtle implication of potentially replacing Grace with her agency's staff. This was not just a visit, it was a territorial assertion, a passive-aggressive threat to Grace's livelihood. Grace's gaze hardened. The accumulated slights, the memory of the library, the mud, the casual racism, it all converged into a singular point of defiance. She looked at Leo, who had stopped barking and was now sitting patiently, his gaze fixed on her, a silent, steadfast presence, the dog's unspoken support, his simple, pure insistence, resonated deep within her. For years, she had swallowed the bile of injustice. Not today, not with Mrs. Albright's smug condescension mirroring Victoria Langford's cruel indifference, and with the palpable threat to her very means of survival hanging in the air. She walked to the front door, her steps measured, her spine ramrod straight. She opened it slowly, deliberately. Mrs. Albright, clipboard raised, began to speak, her tone clipped and dismissive. Grace, I'm just here to conduct a routine assessment of Grace cut her off. Her voice, though not loud, resonated with an unexpected firmness, a quiet power that surprised even herself. Mrs. Albright, may I ask why your agency's car is parked directly in front of Mrs. Henderson's driveway, blocking her access? Mrs. Albright faltered, momentarily taken aback by the directness of the question. That's not relevant. We are merely assessing the quality of service. The quality of service, Mrs. Albright, Grace continued, her gaze unwavering, fixed on the older woman's eyes, includes ensuring unobstructed access for residents. And I believe that particular vehicle belongs to Ms. Victoria Langford. Correct? The same Ms. Langford who has caused considerable disturbance on this street. A flicker of unease crossed Mrs. Albright's face. The mention of Victoria Langford, a prominent family in the community, clearly caught her off guard. She glanced nervously at the younger woman behind her, then back at Grace. I fail to see how this pertains to your work. Grace, it pertains to the environment I work in. Mrs. Albright, Grace replied, her voice gaining a quiet force, and to the respect I am afforded, or rather not afforded. In this community, I am a professional. I deliver excellent service, and I do not appreciate casual disrespect, nor do I appreciate veiled threats to my employment. Her words were calm, precise, devoid of anger, yet imbued with an unmistakable challenge. It wasn't a scream, it was a statement, a boundary being drawn. Mrs. Albright's composure cracked, her face flushed. Grace, that is an utterly unprofessional attitude I simply came to observe. Grace finished for her, a faint, almost imperceptible lift of her chin. And I observe that you are in front of Miss Henderson's home, potentially obstructing her access, and you are accompanied by a new employee. I suggest, Mrs. Albright, that if you wish to discuss my performance, you address me directly, and without veiled intentions or unnecessary theatrics. The younger intern, who had been silently watching, now looked at Grace with a mix of awe and trepidation. Mrs. Albright, clearly thrown off balance by Grace's unexpected assertiveness, clutched her clipboard tighter. Her usual polished demeanor had evaporated. She looked from Grace to the parked Mercedes, then back to Grace, a dawning realization in her eyes that this was not the docile, invisible cleaner she expected. This is highly irregular. Grace, Mrs. Albright stammered, her voice losing its crisp authority. Perhaps, Grace agreed, her gaze firm. But sometimes irregularity is required to ensure fairness. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have work to do. Grace stepped back slightly, her hand resting gently on Leo's head. The dog, as if understanding the unspoken victory, let out a soft rumble of satisfaction. Grace did not slam the door shut, but closed it with deliberate slowness, a subtle act of controlled power. She watched through the window as Mrs. Albright, her face now a tight mask of frustrated anger, exchanged a few terse words with the younger intern. Then Rahan, with a huff of exasperation, marched towards the black Mercedes. The intern, looking stunned, followed dutifully. Grace watched them go, a strange mix of exhilaration and trepidation coursing through her. It was a small act, a quiet defiance, but it felt monumental. It was not a grand public protest, but a personal reclamation of dignity. It was the first time she had refused to fold, the first time she had pushed back against the insidious currents of prejudice, and it had started, not with a roaring cry, but with the quiet, insistent nudges of an old dog. The cage of silence, she realized, was beginning to bend. The following Saturday, the Elmwood Drive Community Center hummed with the controlled energy of the annual Neighborhood Association meeting. Crystal chandeliers, usually reserved for gala events, cast a subdued gleam over polished wooden tables, now laden with refreshments. Grace Mbatha, employed for the event's cleanup, moved through the room with her usual efficiency, collecting discarded coffee cups and straightening scattered pamphlets. Her earlier quiet act of defiance against Mrs. Albright had given her a brittle, newfound resolve, a steel hidden beneath her polite demeanor. She was no longer just the invisible cleaner. She was an observer, a witness to the subtle machinations of power and privilege that played out in these opulent spaces. Arthur Langford, a man whose presence commanded immediate respect, sat at the head table, his distinguished gray hair a stark contrast to the youthful, almost arrogant blonde mane of his daughter, Victoria, seated beside him. Victoria, ever the social butterfly, laughed brightly, her voice cutting through the polite murmur of conversation as she engaged a small cluster of admiring neighbors. Her perfectly tailored silk blouse seemed to shimmer with an air of untouchable superiority. Arthur, however, seemed distant, his gaze occasionally drifting to Grace, a flicker of something unreadable, perhaps shame, perhaps contemplation, in his deep-set eyes. He had been quietly observing Grace for days, noticing her unwavering professionalism, the quiet dignity with which she carried out her duties, and the stark contrast it presented to his daughter's casual cruelty. The meeting began with a mundane agenda: park maintenance, zoning updates, discussions about local initiatives. Victoria Langford, surprisingly, had put her name down to speak on community harmony and mutual respect, a topic that struck Grace as a bitter irony. When her turn came, Victoria strode confidently to the podium, her smile radiating an artificial warmth. She began her speech, her voice a practiced melody of civic engagement, speaking of inclusivity, of bridging divides, of the importance of treating everyone with dignity. Her words, though hollow, were delivered with such conviction that many in the room nodded in agreement, swayed by her polished rhetoric. Grace, standing near the back, felt a familiar wave of nausea. The hypocrisy was suffocating. She gripped the edge of a serving cart, her knuckles white. She looked at Arthur Langford, whose eyes, usually so composed, now held a deep-seated agitation. He shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his gaze fixed on his daughter's eloquent, yet utterly false, performance. Victoria concluded her speech with a flourish, urging everyone to foster a spirit of genuine compassion for all members of our community, regardless of their background. Polite applause rippled through the room. As Victoria turned to return to her seat, Grace felt an electric current surge through her. The moment was ripe, saturated with the very hypocrisy it claimed to abhor. The cage of silence, long a prison, now felt like a lever. "Excuse me." A voice, clear and steady, cut through the fading applause. Every head in the room turned. It was Grace. She had stepped forward, not aggressively, but with a quiet, undeniable authority. Her cleaning uniform, though neat, stood in stark contrast to the designer clothes of the attendees, marking her as an outsider. Yet her gaze, unwavering and direct, commanded attention. "Victoria," caught off guard, froze, her smile faltering. Mrs. Albright, who was also present, having secured a cleaning contract for the community center, gasped audibly, a horrified hand flying to her mouth. Miss Langford, Grace continued, her voice gaining strength, though still calm. You speak eloquently of compassion and mutual respect. I must ask, do those values extend to everyone in this community, or only to those who fit your aesthetic? A collective gasp rippled through the room. Victoria's face, usually so composed, flushed a furious red. Arthur Langford sat bolt upright, his eyes widening. What on earth are you talking about? Victoria spat, her composure cracking, the veneer of civility instantly dissolving. This is completely inappropriate. I don't even know who you are. Oh, you know who I am. Ms. Langford, Grace countered, her voice now a low, resonant hum, carrying effortlessly through the hushed room. I am Grace Mbatha. I am a cleaner in this community, and I am the woman you deliberately splashed with mud from your car last Tuesday morning on Elmwood Drive. A stunned silence descended. All eyes swung to Victoria, then to Arthur. Victoria's face was now a mask of pure, unadulterated fury and shock. That's a ridiculous lie. You're just some disgruntled employee trying to cause trouble. I would never do such a thing. She turned to the room, appealing for solidarity. This is slander. She's clearly unstable, but Grace held her ground. Are you saying, Miss Langford, that on Tuesday morning, you did not, in fact, drive your black Mercedes-Benz S-Class directly into a large puddle on Elmwood Drive, deliberately swerving to splash me as I walked past? Victoria stammered, her gaze darting frantically around the room, searching for an escape. It was an accident. The rain, the roads were slick. Her voice was shrill, unconvincing. An accident. Ms. Langford, Grace pressed, her voice infused with a quiet, searing indignation. Or a deliberate act of malice, followed by a knowing smirk as you drove away. At this, Arthur Langford, who had been watching the exchange with a growing sense of dread and grim recognition, suddenly pushed his chair back. The scrape of wood on the floor was shockingly loud in the silent room. Every eye snapped to him. Victoria! Arthur's voice was low, laced with a profound disappointment that was far more damning than any shout. Don't lie. Victoria whirled, her eyes wide with betrayal. Father, what are you doing? Arthur ignored her. He looked directly at Grace, his face etched with a painful sincerity. Grace, I apologize. My daughter's actions were inexcusable, and they were not an accident. He then turned to face the stunned audience, his voice now strong, resonant with authority. I witnessed the entire incident. I was driving behind Victoria, just turning into our drive. She swerved intentionally. She looked at Grace, and she smirked as she drove away. It was a cruel, calculated act, and it was a disgrace. The revelation from Arthur Langford, the undisputed patriarch of one of Elmwood Drive's most respected families, hit the room like a thunderclap. Whispers erupted, quickly escalating into a cacophony of murmurs and gasps. Mrs. Albright, her face pale, looked as though she might faint. The younger cleaning intern, who had accompanied her, stared at Grace with wide-eyed admiration. Mrs. Henderson, a quiet presence in the front row, reached out and gently squeezed Grace's arm, a silent gesture of solidarity and support. Victoria, cornered, her carefully constructed facade crumbling around her, let out a choked cry of outrage. This is an outrage. You're betraying me, Father, for a cleaner. Her words, dripping with undisguised contempt for Grace, only served to further condemn her in the eyes of the stunned community. Arthur's eyes narrowed, a cold fury replacing the earlier disappointment. You have disgraced this family. Victoria, not Grace. You. The room was in an uproar. Some neighbors looked on in shock, others in quiet vindication, while a few exchanged knowing glances, perhaps having suspected Victoria's true character all along. Grace stood tall amidst the chaos, the mud from the previous week still an invisible stain on her dignity, but now, finally, brought into the light. Her silence had given way to a powerful voice, and the truth, witnessed and affirmed, was beginning to dismantle the carefully constructed narrative of privilege and impunity. The evidence was not just the mud, but Arthur Langford's unwavering testimony, stripping away Victoria's lies and exposing the raw, ugly prejudice beneath. The aftermath of Arthur Langford's damning confession at the community meeting was an immediate, explosive rupture. The polite murmurs of the Elmwood Drive elite transformed into a cacophony of shocked whispers, outraged exclamations, and frantic phone calls. Victoria Langford, her face contorted with a mixture of disbelief and searing humiliation, attempted to flee, pushing past stunned neighbors. But Arthur's stern voice, cutting through the din, stopped her cold. "Victoria, you are not leaving until we address this." He then addressed the room, his voice heavy with a profound sense of duty and shame. "As the president of this neighborhood association, and as a father, I cannot condone such an act. This is not merely a personal failing. It is a blatant disregard for the dignity of another human being, right here in our community. I intend to ensure that Grace Mbatha receives a full and public apology, and that appropriate reparations are made. Beyond that, the broader implications of this incident and my daughter's behavior will be addressed with the utmost seriousness." His gaze, steely and unwavering, lingered on Victoria, a silent promise of swift consequences. Before anyone could fully process Arthur's statement, a young man, a community activist and local journalist named Omar Hassan, who had been attending the meeting to cover the park initiatives, stepped forward. He had been quietly recording Victoria's speech and Grace's confrontation on his phone. His eyes, usually discerning, now gleamed with the intensity of a man who had stumbled upon a seismic revelation. "Mr. Langford, with all due respect, a public apology, while important, may not be sufficient. This appears to be a clear case of assault and potentially a racially motivated one." He held up his phone, indicating the recording. "I have this entire exchange on video, including Ms. Langford's initial denial and your subsequent confirmation. This footage will be made public." Victoria let out a strangled cry, her last shred of composure disintegrating. The threat of public exposure, captured on video, was a far greater terror than her father's disapproval. Arthur, however, looked at Omar with a calm, almost weary nod. "You are right, Mr. Hassan. I understand the implications. The law must take its course." Within hours, the story exploded. Omar Hassan, true to his word, uploaded the video clip to a local news blog and social media platforms. The raw, unfiltered footage of Grace's quiet dignity against Victoria's furious denial, followed by Arthur Langford's devastating corroboration, went viral with astonishing speed. The mud-splashing incident, initially a minor, personal humiliation, rapidly transformed into a national conversation about privilege, casual racism, and accountability. The police were called to the Langford residence later that evening, not by Grace, who had quietly gone home, overwhelmed but resolute, but by Arthur himself. He insisted that Victoria be held accountable. The officers, accustomed to dealing with minor neighborhood disputes, found themselves in an unprecedented situation, the powerful head of a prominent family essentially pressing charges against his own daughter. Victoria, initially defiant, screaming about her rights and calling her lawyer, finally crumpled under the weight of her father's unwavering resolve and the looming threat of the viral video. She was formally charged with misdemeanor assault and battery, and later, a civil suit for emotional distress and punitive damages was filed by a pro bono legal team, drawn by the public outcry and Omar Hassan's relentless reporting. The community's response was fractured but intense. Initially, many of Elmwood Drive's residents were in shock, unable to reconcile the image of the seemingly benevolent Langford family with such blatant cruelty. Some, particularly those who benefited from the Langford's philanthropy or social standing, expressed polite disbelief, dismissing it as an unfortunate misunderstanding. "Victoria is usually such a sweet girl," was a common refrain, quickly countered by those who had long witnessed her thinly veiled disdain for service workers and people of color. However, a significant portion of the community, particularly those from diverse backgrounds and the working class, rallied around Grace. Mrs. Henderson, deeply upset by the incident, immediately offered Grace an advance on her wages and helped organize a small, private fundraiser among her trusted friends to cover any immediate financial strain. The younger cleaning intern who had witnessed Grace's confrontation with Mrs. Albright at Mrs. Henderson's house, a young woman named Sarah, publicly shared her own experiences with Mrs. Albright's discriminatory practices and Victoria's entitled behavior, validating Grace's account. This began to crack the veneer of Elmwood Drive's polished facade. A local civil rights organization, seeing the widespread public interest, offered Grace their full support, connecting her with seasoned legal counsel and media relations experts. Omar Hassan, fueled by a sense of righteous indignation, continued to publish follow-up articles, interviewing other service workers in the area who shared similar stories of subtle and overt discrimination from affluent residents. The collective testimony painted a stark picture of a privileged community where power imbalances often led to casual cruelty and systemic injustice. Mrs. Albright, facing immense public pressure and internal scrutiny from her agency, was forced to issue a public apology to Grace Mbatha for her unprofessional conduct and implicit bias. Though it rang hollow to many, the agency, fearing a public relations disaster, quietly initiated an internal investigation into her management practices. For Grace, the immediate consequences were overwhelming. Her phone rang incessantly with media requests. Strangers approached her in the grocery store, offering words of encouragement or sharing their own stories of discrimination. It was a dizzying, often exhausting shift from invisibility to sudden, unwanted public scrutiny. Yet, amidst the chaos, there was a growing sense of vindication, a profound awareness that her quiet endurance had finally given way to a powerful wave of public consciousness. The mud on her uniform had become a symbol, not of her humiliation, but of a greater truth exposed. And the community, though initially fractured, was beginning to awaken to the uncomfortable realities hidden beneath their manicured lawns. The ripple effect was just beginning. The character begins rebuilding, shares their story, spreads awareness, gains traction, or the character begins rebuilding, shares their story, spreads awareness, gains traction on social media. The world, which had once rendered Grace Mbatha invisible, now clamored for her voice. The viral video, a raw, unvarnished testament to her dignity and Victoria Langford's contempt, had shattered the quiet on social media. The sudden glare of the spotlight was disorienting for Grace Mbatha. From a life meticulously constructed around invisibility and quiet endurance, she was now thrust into the epicenter of a national conversation. The viral video, a raw, unedited testament anonymity that had defined Grace's life. Suddenly, she was no longer just a cleaner. She was a symbol, a reluctant beacon of resilience in the face of systemic injustice. The phone, once silent, now rang incessantly. Local news outlets, to Victoria Langford's cruelty and Arthur Langford's surprising integrity, became the catalyst. Grace's face, initially a symbol of quiet humiliation, was now becoming an emblem of resilience and the stark reality of systemic injustice. The immediate aftermath was a whirlwind of activity. The civil rights organization, true to their word, provided Grace with a dedicated legal team, ensuring she understood every step of the civil suit against Victoria. More importantly, they connected her with media strategy national networks, podcasts, and online publications. All sought her story. Initially, the sudden thrust into the public spotlight was disorienting, even frightening. Grace, accustomed to navigating life in the shadows, found the glare of public scrutiny overwhelming. She was warriors who helped her navigate the treacherous waters of public attention. They coached her on how to conduct interviews, how to articulate her experiences without succumbing to anger, and how to focus her narrative on awareness rather than retribution. Your story will too, remembering the painful lessons of the past, how quickly narratives could be twisted, how easily victims could be re-victimized by a hungry media machine. But the civil rights organization, having taken her case pro bono, provided invaluable grace. Her lawyer advised, is a mirror for society. Let them see what's reflected. Grace, despite her initial discomfort with public speaking, recognized the power of her voice. She began by sharing her story in small, local guidance. They assigned her a compassionate media liaison, a seasoned professional named Lena, who helped Grace filter requests, prepare for interviews, and most importantly, control her narrative. Grace decided to speak, not for vengeance, but for change forums, community centers, and church gatherings. Her narratives were deeply personal, recounting not just the mud-splashing incident, but the quiet humiliations of her cleaning jobs, the dismissive attitude at the clinic, the constant pressure of making. She wanted her story to be a mirror, reflecting the uncomfortable truths that many chose to ignore. Her first major interview was with Omar Hassan, the journalist whose integrity and immediate action had been instrumental in bringing her story to light. Sitting across ends meet and the enduring sting of the library incident, each story told with quiet dignity and a heartbreaking honesty, resonated deeply with audiences who had experienced similar, often unacknowledged, microaggressions. People nodded, their eyes welling up with recognition from him. In a quiet room at the Civil Rights Organization's office, Grace spoke with a quiet power that belied her past reticence. She recounted the mud-splashing incident with calm precision, detailing the humiliation, the lingering. Some approached her afterward, eager to share their own suppressed stories. The media coverage for him, spearheaded by Omar Hassan's relentless reporting, grew exponentially. National news outlets picked up the story, inviting Grace for televised interviews. Her calm demeanor, her articulate sting of the deliberate act. But she didn't stop there. She bravely peeled back the layers of her life, sharing the formative trauma of the library incident, the casual dehumanization she experienced daily as a Black cleaner in affluent neighborhoods, the systemic barriers responses, and her unwavering focus on the broader issues of racial and economic inequality made her a compelling figure. She spoke not of anger, but of the need for empathy, for recognition of humanity in every individual, regardless of their station. She emphasized that hurt to her son Amani's healthcare and education. She spoke of the exhaustion of constantly being viewed with suspicion, of the subtle slights that chipped away at her spirit, of the constant anxiety over her family's precarious financial situation. Her voice was steady. Fight was not just for herself, but for all the invisible workers, the marginalized voices, who silently endured daily indignities. Her social media presence, managed with the help of the Civil Rights Organization, exploded. A hashtag, #HatMud, infused not with bitterness, but with a profound, almost weary honesty. It wasn't just the mud, she explained, her eyes fixed on Omar. It was everything that mud represented. The assumption that my dignity was less valuable, the truth, quickly gained traction, becoming a rallying cry for countless individuals who identified with Grace's plight. People shared their own stories under the hashtag, creating a powerful, collective tapestry of experiences that exposed the pervasive nature of everyday racism and class. The idea that I was disposable, that I could be humiliated without consequence. The interview, published online with Omar's compelling prose in the original viral video, resonated deeply. The comments section exploded with solidarity. People from all walks of ism, pictures of mud-splashed shoes and uniforms flooded the internet, alongside poignant testimonies of being overlooked, undervalued, or demeaned. The campaign garnered millions of impressions, drawing attention from activists, academics, and even politicians. Grace also used Life shared their own experiences of microaggressions, of being overlooked, dismissed, or mistreated due to their race, class, or background. Service workers, particularly, flooded the platforms with stories that mirrored Grace's, painting a powerful, collective portrait of unseen indignities. Hashtags like Justice for Grace and Invisible No More trended across social media, becoming rallying cries for those who had felt unheard. Grace cautiously embraced social media. With Lena's help, she started this platform to advocate for concrete changes. She spoke passionately about better wages and working conditions for service workers, about accessible and equitable healthcare for low-income families, and about the importance of diversity and inclusion education in affluent communities. She highlighted the systemic barriers a simple blog, Grace's Voice, sharing short, poignant reflections on her experiences, on resilience, and on the importance of seeing and respecting every individual. She posted photos of Amani, of her small, beloved apartment, of her hands that prevented people of color from advancing, using her own experiences with the cleaning agency and the library as examples of how subtle biases could derail lives. Her message was clear: this wasn't about a single incident, it was about a deeply calloused from years of labor, clutching a worn book. She began to receive messages from across the globe, words of encouragement, shared empathy, and even donations to a small fund set up by the civil rights organization to support her family and entrenched system. Donations poured in not just for Grace's legal fund, but for community initiatives she endorsed, such as a scholarship fund for underprivileged students and a legal aid clinic for marginalized workers. A group of local artists, inspired by her growing advocacy work. Her story prompted tangible changes in the Elmwood Drive community. A significant number of residents, genuinely appalled by Victoria's actions and Arthur Langford's public admission, began to reevaluate their own unconscious story, created a powerful mural in her honor in the heart of her neighborhood, depicting her standing tall amidst swirling patterns of mud and cleansing rain, her eyes resolute. The mural became a local landmark, a visual testament to her courage. The biases. Several homeowners reached out to their cleaners, gardeners, and other service workers, initiating conversations, offering apologies for past insensitivities, and inquiring about better pay and working conditions. The narrative of the invisible worker was being actively challenged. Change in Grace was profound. The woman who once sought invisibility now stood confidently in the glare of public scrutiny, her quiet voice amplified to a roar. The fear of speaking out, once a defining characteristic, had been replaced by a fierce determination. At Amani's school, the principal, alerted to the widespread discussion about Grace, implemented new diversity and inclusion workshops for staff and students, encouraging open dialogue about prejudice. The local clinic, facing scrutiny from Omar's ongoing investigations to ensure that no one else had to endure what she had. She still cleaned, continuing her work with Mrs. Henderson, finding a familiar comfort in the rhythm of the tasks. But now her cleaning uniform felt less like a symbol of subservience and more like a uniform of resilience, a visible reminder of her journey and the battle she was fighting. She was no longer just Grace Mbatha, the cleaner. She was Grace Mbatha, the advocate, the voice of the voiceless. Rebuilding announced a review of their patient intake procedures, promising to address complaints of discriminatory treatment. Grace's story was not just about her. It became a catalyst. She participated in online forums, speaking to groups of young people, emphasizing the power of standing up, not just for oneself, but for the collective dignity of all. She spoke of her past trauma, not to dwell on it, but to illustrate the corrosive effects of silence and the transformative power of finding one's voice. She not just her own life, but contributing to the reshaping of societal consciousness, one story, one shared experience, at a time. The public impact was undeniable. The silent humiliation was now a loud, insistent call for justice.